Coming to the election, a point that you note in your book is there are similarities with the 1856 election and that whole pre-Civil War time period and today. What are some of those similarities, and can you tie that into the decision for John to run for president and the decision to throw their hat in the 1856 election?
Oh, absolutely. Some of the similarities are that it was a divided nation. That's kind of a surface similarity, but let's just stick it there for a moment. We have red states and blue states today. It wasn't exactly the same in the 1850s, but there were northern states that had gradually abolished slavery and southern states that embraced slavery. And that was a huge and increasingly yawning divide. It was a time of great technological change, which was disruptive. It was a time of expanding and accelerating mass media, which made communication better, would seem like it would bring people together, but actually just quickened the political discourse in ways that made it destabilizing. It was a time of great demographic change, just like today, where you have certain racial groups that are growing more rapidly than others, and that to some people feels destabilizing. In those days, the North's population was growing a lot more rapidly than the South, which is something that people in the South found to be a severe political threat because that population, of course, produced also political power. So these things were happening that feel very similar to today. And there were also movements against immigrants, which was part of a larger debate over the American identity. Who got to be American? Who counted as American and who didn't?
John was the first candidate for the Republican Party in 1856.
Yeah.
What did that mean? Was he planting his flag on abolitionism or some other reason that he ran on this ticket?
No, not exactly abolitionism. This is something that is important to underline.
Yes.
This was a really deeply racist time. There were abolitionists, but they were considered by the mainstream politicians to be extremists. The Republican Party, when it was founded, did not openly call for the abolition of slavery, but considered an anti-slavery party by the standards of the time. And what they proposed to do was to restrict the spread of slavery into the newly opened western territories of the United States, to restrain slavery where it was. It was considered unconstitutional to do anymore, and they did not propose to do anymore. They nevertheless were an anti-slavery party, and they were a new party that proposed to take advantage of the demographic change in the country and win the presidency with Northern votes alone. In order to do that, they wanted a very popular presidential candidate with a very short political record that would be hard to attack. And John C. Frémont had both of those things. He had fame and popularity, and he also had a very short political record.
How did they frame themselves in this way in 1856? Did they run on John Frémont's celebrity? Was it a positions campaign?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, they had a platform. It was restricting slavery in the territories. It was upholding free speech because there was a feeling that the South would not allow criticism of slavery at all. There were a variety of things that they stood for. But Frémont's image was his major qualification as a presidential candidate. Here was this guy who had presented himself to the world as a heroic individual, battling the elements, battling Indians, battling Mexicans, and triumphing again and again, and associating himself with the conquest of California just in time for the gold rush, by the way, which made the fortune of the United States and also made John Frémont's fortune. He had this huge, huge public image and was very much considered the man of the hour, even though when some Republican politicians began looking at his anti-slavery record, he was opposed to the expansion of slavery, but it was a pretty thin record. He just hadn't been that politically involved on that issue. It was a somewhat manufactured record. The biggest qualification that he had was his fame.
What is the dynamic like with the couple when they're on the campaign trail? And I'm thinking of other presidential power couples, FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt, Bill and Hillary Clinton, Abigail and John Adams, although I don't know as much about their dynamic as well. But how does their couple dynamic play out on the campaign trail?
Yeah, the first thing to know is that they didn't campaign very much at all. This was a time when you might scheme behind the scenes for years to become president, but you were supposed to pretend you didn't really want the job. It was considered undignified to campaign for the job. And so when they were nominated, they weren't even present at the convention. the Republican convention that nominated them, and they did not go out and campaign. If you were a candidate, it's so different than today. If you were a candidate, you were supposed to avoid giving speeches. If you were forced once in a while to give a speech, you would try to avoid saying anything important. If on occasion you were forced to say something important, you would probably write it down in a letter and let it be leaked to the newspapers so the world would know your very carefully chosen words, but they hadn't actually been seemingly written for public consumption. It was a very hidden and careful way to campaign. But while this campaign was going on, Jessie, as a woman, played a significant role. She was one of the campaign managers, not the campaign manager, but joined a group of men on the correspondence committee that would take care of the incoming mail and would decide which of that mail that the candidate would see and would weigh in on various political matters as the campaign became more and more difficult and more controversial. Jessie Frémont was involved in this too, but according to his spouse, according to his wife, he had difficulty taking all the vitriol of the campaign, and she would withhold some newspapers from him so he wouldn't get too upset, and he would greet visiting delegations of people who came to see him and give one of these empty speeches where he avoided saying anything important, and the rest of the time he might be with a friend fencing in the hall of their New York City house while Jessie and some of the other men were doing that day-to-day work.
Well, he tried to become president at a time where America saw one of its worst presidents followed by one of its best. This is pure speculation, but in an alternate universe where John Fremont won the election, what kind of president you think he would have been? How would he have handled the issues that James Buchanan bungled? And what would Jessie be like as a first lady?
Well, we can have some informed speculation here and rely a little bit on people who knew the Fremonts well. The first thing to think about is, if John C. Fremont had won in 1856, the Civil War might have come right away after that, instead of 4 years later, more than 4 years later in 1861. The South Southern leaders resolved that if the Republican, this Northern Party, ever won the presidency, they would leave the Union. And we know they meant it because when Lincoln won in 1860, they left the Union and fired the first shot of the Civil War. That could very well have happened in 1856 had Fremont won then. And then instead of Lincoln being the president at that time of crisis, Fremont would be the president at that time of crisis. Now, the Fremonts always believed that because they were both of Southern birth and they had Southern families, that they might somehow be able to use their family connections to keep the country together and ward off a war. But from the distance of more than a century and a half, that seems like an awfully thin reed. It seems very possible the war would have come several years earlier than it did. And Fremont's friends, even ones who promoted him for the presidency, later decided, as he had his bad Civil War and blew his fortune in the 1870s and made a number of other mistakes, they decided that he really lacked judgment, and that while they were glad that he was nominated and helped put together the Republican Party that ultimately ended slavery and saved the Union, they were also glad that he wasn't elected president because they thought he would have been a terrible president. Because he had shown such erratic judgment throughout his career, it was less evident in the early years when he was leading small groups of men in the West. Some of his expeditions ended in disaster with several men killed. Some of his expeditions ended in massacres of Indians, but some of them were extraordinary successes, or he was able to paint them as extraordinary successes. And so his persistence that could become stubbornness, his erratic judgment, his failure of good political instincts were not as evident in the earlier years, but they became quite evident in the Civil War when Fremont, as still this national hero, was appointed by Lincoln as a general in charge of Missouri. And facing a chaotic situation, issued an order freeing the slaves of Missouri rebels. It was a step that Lincoln himself was not yet ready to take. The Emancipation Proclamation hadn't come yet. Lincoln hadn't freed any slaves or had deliberately freed any slaves. And he wasn't ready for that step. And he asked Fremont to back off, and Fremont refused, instead sending Jessie to Washington to tell Lincoln what was what. And she argued with Abraham Lincoln and lost that argument. And ultimately, John C. Fremont was fired. Lincoln fired him. Lincoln then gave him a different general's job. He was defeated in battle and relieved again. Still later, he ran against Abraham Lincoln in 1864 for president when Lincoln was seeking re-election. He withdrew before the balloting, but there was this series of events in which the very people at the heart of the Republican Party who had once supported John C. Frémont found reason to question his judgment again and again.
You think Jessie would have fared better as First Lady, or her legacy would have been tied and drugged down by his legacy?
Oh, well, if he was a bad president, I'm sure that we would think less of her. But it is fascinating to read the accounts of some of these Republicans that I'm referring to. People like John Bigelow, the editor of the New York Post once upon a time, who'd been a huge Frémont supporter and a key part of the campaign, concluded that John C. Frémont would have been a terrible president, but he was one of many people who continued to have a very high opinion of Jessie. And people would sometimes say, it's lucky that John was never president, but it's too bad that Jessie was never First Lady. They admired her. They understood her to be a very different individual of her time who had ultimately worked within traditional gender requirements. She was a wife, she was a mother, she stayed at home while her husband went off exploring, but she had figured out a way to also carve her own path and do things that were associated more with men in that much more restrictive time. People admired that and admired her even when they lost respect for him. But surely if he had had a terrible presidency, it would have affected everyone's view of her too.
You mentioned the parallels between the antebellum era and today in first the context of political polarization. We didn't get into the usage and maybe manipulation of media back then, which many argue today is also happening. So what do you think is the lessons or the most striking aspects of the book of looking at this power couple that you can see with parallels to today?
Well, there's a national lesson, I think, that it's very destabilizing when you have big demographic change in a country that leaves one side or the other fearful that they'll be shut out of power forever. That is something that happened in the Civil War period and the run-up to the Civil War. It's something that's happening now. I'm not in any way forecasting a civil war. I'm just saying that is part of the reason that we have some of the political angst and the bitterness and the vitriol that we have today, because people believe the stakes are really high and that their side is at risk of losing forever. And it's getting to the point where Republicans and Democrats both have those fears in different ways. So that's one lesson. The other thing, though, I think is to understand people in all of their complexity. I find the Frémonts fascinating. I find them fascinating as a couple. I find them fascinating for their strengths as well as their weaknesses. And I think they're like a lot of people in that their strengths are their weaknesses. Just to give one example, John's persistence is what made it possible for him to go over the Rocky Mountains with small groups of men, to go over the Sierra Nevada in the snow, to go the length of the Oregon Trail, to survive one disastrous situation after another. That was his persistence. But of course, persistence can also be stubbornness. And very often, the very deadly situations that John struggled to survive were brought about by his own stubbornness. And ultimately, his decline in reputation was brought about by his own stubbornness. For reasons like that, the Frémonts are just fascinating.
Absolutely. And there's a lot more to unpack with their story. And they are a big what if in history because they were so pivotal in their time. So the book is Imperfect Union, How Jessie and John Frémont Mapped the West, Invented Celebrity, and Helped Cause the Civil War. Steve, thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to do it.
All right, listeners. Well, that is all that I have for today's episode. As always, I'd like to kick things off by thanking the Spy Masters for History Unplugged. I'll explain what that is in a second. Our Spy Masters include Baron Fraza, Chris C., David Santee, the McRaes, Jake Harrington, Jennifer French Lee, Josh Reddick, Carl from Norway, Michael from New York, Nick Brooks, Rob from Chicago, Ryan Gillen, Tom from Ohio, Moondoggy from Ohio, Tyler from Colorado, and Bill Ivey. If you'd like to support the show, there's some very easy ways to do so. First, go to the site halfpricehistory.com. I've worked out an arrangement with a lot of the authors who've appeared on this show, and you can go there and get their books for 50% off. All you have to do is go to halfpricehistory.com and enter the promo code UNPLUGGED at checkout. Second, please leave a review and subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast player of choice, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify or Stitcher or whatever. Third, join our Facebook group. You can go to Facebook and search for History Unplugged. There, you can talk with other fans of the show about recent episodes, what you liked, what you didn't like. Also, I have exclusive content there, such as live streams where I do live versions of podcast episodes where you can leave feedback as I'm talking, and I will address it on air. Last, and I think this is